project. This time, I took a wedding dress and made a baby quilt.
So a friend asked if I could turn her old, albeit wrinkled, but beautiful wedding dress into a baby quilt. I said sure, but then this was one of the hardest things I had to do. And this was also the hardest thing I had to do. Decide what it was going to be when I was done. I have only made a few quilts. I haven't done a whole lot of quilting, and this is not the ideal fabric for quilting. It is way too slippery, plus it ravels like crazy. But it was necessary to turn the wedding dress into the baby quilt that you use the wedding dress. I decided the best thing for me to do was to make a stripped quilt. A stripped quilt wasn't going to require so many points to come together. And I also increased my seam allowance from 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch when I pieced the top. This rotary cutter was a fantastic tool for cutting these strips. And then I made myself a list of how many pieces I was going to need at each size. I started with the longest pieces to make sure I could get them out of a clean piece. After I had cut enough pieces of each length, I made a little post-it note and pinned all of those same length pieces together to try to keep myself at least somewhat organized as I put this quilt top together. Then I checked it off of my list that I had enough of those pieces and continued to cut pieces of the various lengths. Now, for a wedding dress to be such an expensive and wonderful garment, it's amazing how dirty they get. And let's just say this one has been in the closet for a hot minute. Now that I have all of the pieces cut into strips, it's time to do some embellishment. So I went around the top of the dress where all the beautiful lace was and started chopping on it again. I measured some of them to make sure, am I getting the right size piece? Are these going to fit in my squares? And the size of the motifs was going to work beautifully with the size of my strips. So I chopped on lace everywhere. Here I cut out the front, the whole top of the neck, but I started in the front because, well, just because. Anyway, I kept cutting until I had all of the ones that were interesting to me. And then I took them off of the satin. They were just zigzagged on, so it was easy enough to get them all off. The first one I did had to be the easiest because I was able to keep just a little bit of that netting from up at the neckline. So I just sewed it onto another square that was the same size. It's hard to see the netting in the picture, but there's netting there on that top edge. Easy peasy. Then the rest of them I zigzagged around the outside edge of the lace motif. Now if this is something you decide to do, remember to stop with your needle to the outside of the lace before you turn so that your zigzags overlap easily. And here are some of the other beautiful pieces of lace I used. The next set of squares I worked on was the padded hearts. So in order to do those, I had the advantage of having an embroidery machine. So I sewed squares onto the back of the big piece of fabric that I had left from the dress so that I could work with these sort of like pockets. Then I put them in the embroidery machine and sewed just the outline of the heart. The machine made them perfect hearts for me instead of me trying to do them by hand and ending up with sort of hearts. So anyway, I did those for each of the ones that I had sewn on the back, and then I cut them apart into the individual squares. To stuff them, first I had to cut a hole in through the back so that I could get the polyfill in there. So I pulled it apart and made a little snip, and then I could stick my scissors in there to make it bigger. But I did check to make sure I wasn't cutting through both layers because that would have not been the best choice. A little polyfill to make these hearts nice and fluffy. Shoved it in the hole there. It was hard to get it in because the satin is so ravelly that it just turned into all these little fibers in the way. But filled that relatively full, and then I did a zigzag stitch across it to close up that hole in the back. It was kind of a Frankenstein stitch. Nothing that was ever going to be seen again once I finished the quilt, so I just did enough to keep all of my batting from coming out. Beautiful. The next thing was going to do with the buttons, because what baby quilt doesn't need buttons on it? Anyway, I have these twin needles, which are something I use for heirloom sewing, but they make pin tucks that are perfectly straight. So I folded and made a finger crease so that I could keep a straight line, and sewed each side of that to make 2 of those pin tucks. When you thread your machine for this, you just add the next piece of thread and then go through both needles, but it all goes through the same tension and everything. So then I made marks every ½ inch where I wanted to put these buttons so that they would be spaced perfectly, and sewed them on. Now, they did not have holes. They had fabric in the back, which was, I'm sure, better, but it was sometimes hard to catch it. But I sewed all the buttons on, and I went around at least 3 times on each button because I do want them to stay on, and I don't want them to become some kind of candy for this special baby. So back and forth through those, like I said. And I used the thread double. So every time I went through it, it was actually 2 pieces of thread that was staying in there to hold it. Once I got each button on, instead of cutting the thread and starting a new piece, I tied it off at the back where that button was, and then I tied it into the dot, the square, the mark, where the next button was going to go. That way I didn't have to keep cutting and retying it. I did tie it as many times, I just didn't cut it as many times and have to do it with that little bit of a tail. So then I sewed on the next button. Oh, drop that button, that's fine, I'll find it in a minute. Here, also on this button instead. So, sew on this button so that I can have a nice straight line of buttons on these diagonal little pieces. And magic, 5 buttons! Now back to the plan. I kept this handy so that I could remember what order all of these things needed to go in. I laid them out across the front of my table in the order they needed to be so that they could be upright. The hearts needed to be upright, and I wanted all the diagonals to go the same way. Even some of the lace had a better up or down. Then I took the one that would be the bottom one and I folded over on top of the one that was going to be above it, and sewed that. Remember, I did a ½ inch just because it was this satin. And then I worked my way down that strip with the pieces that I had laid out in front of me. Like I said, with the ones laid out, flip the bottom one up on top of it and sew across. And I did that for each of the 8 strips across. And as much as I was trying to be careful, I'll tell you now, they were not all the same length. I don't know where I messed up, but once it was done, it was okay. Like I said, I haven't done a lot of quilts, so it was a little challenging to me. Anyway, once I got all of those strips made, I ironed those seams open flat. But I didn't iron too hard on top of my pin tucks or on top of my heart because I didn't want to iron out the detail that I had worked so hard to make. I was careful to keep my iron on a low setting and not just melt or burn or whatever and ruin the fabric that I was doing. Then it was time to sew the 8 strips together across. So I started at the top and sewed ½ inch seam allowances, and when I got to the place where there was the cross seam, I made sure that those seam allowances stayed open flat and not get all bunched up, folded, or messy underneath the inside of the quilt. Okay, the first 2 came out even. Good for me. So there's 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. All 8 strips, and look at that. So fun! Now it's time to iron some more. So the same thing. I'll iron the seams open flat so that they lay down smooth inside the quilt. There it is. The quilt top is done. It came out really nice. Don't look at that bottom edge though. See how some of those pieces are longer and shorter? We don't want to talk about that. Then I serged around the edge. If I was going to do it again, I would wait and serge after I had all my layers together, but live and learn. Now I needed some polyfill, some backing, and some spray glue. The spray glue was really nice to help hold everything smooth. Remember I talked about this stuff being slippery? To try to pin all those layers together, I don't know if I could have managed it. So I have that spray glue that worked really well. I spread it out on the floor. I don't usually do it in the house, but it was raining that day. Spread it out and glued all my layers together. And then the first row that I sewed, I did in the middle of the quilt so that I was going to work from the middle out. And I just did a stitch in the ditch, which is to say you couldn't really see all of the quilting on top. You couldn't see the threads because they were sewn down in right on top of the stitch that held the top pieces together. Part of the challenge here is that the item is so big, and this is just a baby quilt. So I could roll up the side to make it fit under the arm, but my sewing table is actually built into a closet, so there's a back wall, and so I had trouble sometimes that it would get against the back wall and make it difficult for the feed dogs to pull it through. Anyway, worked around all that, and then I sewed around the edge to hold all 3 of the layers together: the top, the batting, and the backing. But wait, there's more. I had to make a binding. I made mine straight on the grain, or pretty close to straight anyway, instead of on the bias, because I only had so much fabric left of the dress. In order to make the strips long enough, I put them at a 45-degree angle and sewed a diagonal corner on them, and then trimmed that. And that makes the pieces not have the bulk of the new piece being sewn to it all in one place. It kind of spreads that out. Iron that and iron those seam allowances flat, and maybe cut off the one I missed. Then iron the whole thing, fold it in half in order to be able to just put it on as a binding. Nice long piece that'll make it all the way around. Trim off all of the extra batting and backing that were there. Now I'm going to sew around. This was a little bit hard because it wanted to slide around. Ugh. But anyway, sewed that around. I don't know how to make the best corners, but the stuff I found was to sew all the way to the edge and then back off and sew again. That would give it a little bit of a miter look and let you keep going with one piece all the way around. So that's what I did. At each corner I would sew all the way to the edge and then fold it back and then sew again from that new edge in order to keep the one piece going. At the very end where I got back to where I started, I sewed it all the way till it was almost touching. Folded it over all the way around. Used a lot of pins this time because it's too slippery and I wanted to keep it around it tight. At the corner I clipped off of the extra little bit of fullness in the corner and then used pins close to the corner going each direction and continued pinning all the way around the whole thing. That last corner, I don't know if I like the way it came out exactly, but it's going to be fine. It just doesn't have quite the same bias look. It's just more of a blunt folded over edge there. Now for the final step, sew around on the binding. And I sewed just a small seam allowance over instead of trying to stitch in the ditch this time because I wanted to be sure and catch that part that was folded around to the back. When you get to the corner, leave the needle down and then spin it. There it is! I got it done! It's so lovely. It was so fun. And here is the mother-to-be and her mother and what was her wedding dress and is now the beautiful baby quilt.
Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed that. Remember, train up a child in the way he should go, and even when he is old, he will not depart from it. See you next time.